The rise of Charles Manson. Charles Manson was born on November 12, 1934, in Cincinnati, Ohio. His early life was marred by instability and neglect. His mother, a teenage alcoholic, spent time in prison, and Manson bounced between relatives and reform schools. By his early adulthood, Manson had a long criminal record, including charges for theft, forgery, and pimping. He spent much of his life in and out of prison. In the mid-1960s, Manson was released from prison in California and gravitated toward the burgeoning counterculture scene in San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district. It was here that he began to develop a following. Manson was an aspiring musician with a knack for manipulating vulnerable people, particularly young women. He preached a blend of pseudo-spirituality and apocalyptic visions, emphasizing free love, communal living, and the idea that he was a messianic figure. His followers, whom he called the family, were primarily young, disenfranchised women, though men also joined. Manson moved his family to a remote location in California, eventually settling at the Spahn Ranch, an old movie set in the Los Angeles hills. Isolated from mainstream society, the family operated like a cult, with Manson exerting total control over his followers. He used drugs, particularly LSD, and his manipulative charisma to maintain his influence. Helter Skelter. Manson's apocalyptic vision. Central to Manson's control over the family was his apocalyptic ideology, which he called Helter Skelter, a term borrowed from a Beatles song. Manson believed, or at least convinced his followers, that a racial war between black and white Americans was imminent. He predicted that black people would rise up and overthrow white society but would ultimately fail to govern themselves, leaving Manson and his family to emerge as the rulers of a new world order. To hasten this imagined apocalypse, Manson devised a plan to commit murders so brutal and senseless that they would be blamed on black militants, thereby inciting racial tension. This chilling belief became the justification for the murders that followed. The Tate murders. On August 8, 1969, Manson instructed a group of his followers, Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian, to go to 10,050 Cielo Drive in Los Angeles and totally destroy everyone in it. The house was rented by actress Sharon Tate and her husband, film director Roman Polanski. Polanski was away in Europe at the time, but Tate, who was 8 months pregnant, was at home with friends. The group arrived at the property late at night. Watson, armed with a revolver and a knife, cut the telephone lines and climbed a fence to gain entry. The murders began when the group encountered Stephen Parent, an 18-year-old visitor leaving the property. Watson shot him 4 times, killing him instantly. Inside the house, the family brutally murdered the occupants. Sharon Tate, celebrity hairstylist Jay Sebring, coffee heiress Abigail Folger, and Folger's boyfriend, Wojciech Frykowski. The scene was one of unimaginable horror. Tate, pleading for the life of her unborn child, was stabbed 16 times. Folger tried to escape but was chased and stabbed 28 times. Frykowski was shot, beaten, and stabbed a total of 51 times. Before leaving, Atkins used Tate's blood to write the word, "pig," on the front door, a grotesque attempt to frame the murders as part of Manson's envisioned race war. The LaBianca murders. The following night, on August 9, Manson accompanied his followers on a second murder mission, though he left before the killings began. This time, their targets were Leno and Rosemary LaBianca, a wealthy couple living in the Los Feliz neighborhood of Los Angeles. Manson tied up the couple and reassured them they wouldn't be harmed, but after he left, the family unleashed another wave of savage violence. Watson stabbed Leno LaBianca with a bayonet, carving the word, "war," into his abdomen. Rosemary was stabbed 41 times. The killers scrawled phrases like, "death to pigs," and "rise," on the walls and refrigerator in the victim's blood. Unlike the Tate murders, there were no connections between the LaBiancas and Manson's circle. The killings appeared random, amplifying public fear and confusion. The investigation. The brutal nature of the murders and their apparent randomness initially stumped law enforcement. For months, investigators struggled to link the Tate and LaBianca murders. A break came in late 1969, when members of the Manson family were arrested on unrelated charges of auto theft. While in custody, Susan Atkins bragged to fellow inmates about her involvement in the killings. Her confession led authorities to connect the dots between the family and the murders. The trial. The trial of Charles Manson and his followers began in 1970 and became a media spectacle. Manson, representing himself at times, used the courtroom as a stage to showcase his bizarre behavior and further manipulate his followers. Family members who weren't on trial camped outside the courthouse, often carving X's into their foreheads in solidarity with Manson. The prosecution, led by Vincent Bugliosi, argued that Manson didn't physically commit the murders but orchestrated them, making him equally culpable. Bugliosi presented the concept of helter-skelter as the motive, illustrating Manson's ability to command his followers to kill. After months of testimony and evidence, Manson, Watson, Atkins, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten, who participated in the LaBianca murders, were convicted of murder. All were sentenced to death in 1971, though their sentences were later commuted to life imprisonment when California briefly abolished the death penalty. The aftermath. The Manson family murders marked the end of the 1960s counterculture era, symbolizing the dark side of the decade's ideals of love and freedom. The case highlighted the dangers of charismatic leaders and the psychological vulnerabilities of those who fall under their sway. Charles Manson remained a figure of infamy until his death in prison in 2017 at the age of 83. His followers, some of whom have expressed remorse, continue to serve life sentences, though a few have been paroled. The legacy of the Manson family murders endures in American culture, serving as a cautionary tale about the power of manipulation and the devastating consequences of blind devotion.